Hello and welcome to The Edge, where we'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge, bringing not just the facts but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. So let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. The UN Human Rights Council has decided to create an open-ended international investigation into violations surrounding Israel's latest airstrikes and its systematic human rights abuses in Gaza and other Palestinian territories. But will Israel be held accountable for its crimes as thousands of Palestinians return to a scene of destruction? Calling the so-called presidential election in Syria illegitimate, residents of opposition-held city Idlib took to the streets in protest against an election which has been dismissed as a sham by many, including the international community. Is there any hope for an end to the plight of the Syrians? And US President Joe Biden has asked his divided intelligence community to redouble their efforts to come closer to a more definitive understanding of the origins of COVID-19 with a 90-day review. The move worsens the already strained relationship between the United States and China. What are the politics behind Biden's recent move? And how will China react to it? Those are the top three stories that we'll be taking a look at today. Beyond the Edge. Since the 1970s, discussions have been held to find a solution to the never-ending Palestinian-Israeli tensions. Well, what proposals have been put forward? Our following infographic explains. The United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on Thursday that includes the urgent establishment of an international independent investigation commission to probe Israel's human rights violations.
The voting is now closed.
The United Nations Human Rights Council agreed on Thursday to launch an international investigation into crimes committed during Israel's 11-day airstrikes in the Gaza Strip. The 47-member forum adopted a resolution brought by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Palestinian delegation to the United Nations.
Draft resolution entitled Ensuring Respect for International Human Rights Law and International Humanitarian Law in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and in Israel, as orally revised, is therefore adopted.
The United States is closest ally did not sign up to address the talks, where it has observer status, appearing to shun the 9th session held on Gaza since 2006. Germany and the United Kingdom were among the 9 countries who voted no.
Regrettably, the self-professed global champions of human rights continue to shield the occupier from global accountability and literally provide arms and ammunition for its widely reported war crimes and crimes of apartheid against the Palestinian people. Let us be clear, there is no legal and moral equivalence between the occupier and the occupied.
Human Rights Watch Geneva Director John Fisher called on the Israel allies to stop shielding them from consequence.
This Council today needs to create a standing mechanism to advance accountability and address root causes. It's time to face the reality unfolding before our eyes. When it comes to ending the crimes of apartheid and persecution, there are no bystanders.
And to discuss this latest move, I'm joined live from Exeter in the United Kingdom by Middle East analyst Jonathan Fenton-Harvey. Jonathan, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge. After the atrocities that we saw being wrought on Gaza that finished, thankfully, the bombing itself finished a week ago, the aftermath, of course, remains. One would expect the whole world to be united against the perpetrators of this, and yet the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution, but only with a majority, not unanimously. Well, what can you tell us about the resolution into investigation?
The resolution itself is definitely an aftermath of, like you quite rightly said, the widespread awareness of Israel's atrocities on the ground in Gaza. You saw over 200 people die, including nearly 70 children. So this kind of outcry is absolutely expected as a result of it. But the violence hasn't completely ended. I mean, it is a short-term solution, this ceasefire. But as we've seen in the past, Israel has complete impunity to carry out any actions it wants on the Gaza Strip. So, and even though there has been criticism of it from this stage, as we've seen from the UN move to investigate potential war crimes, this might not be enough, considering that though the UN is saying this step is important, a lot of the international powers like the United States, the United Kingdom, France and Russia and China wouldn't go as far as they should in condemning Israel or actually pressuring it. It's important to note that last year Israel received more UN condemnations than any other state, yet no action was taken on it. So potentially, even though this UN move is considered to be pressuring Israel and a step forwards as a result of the condemnation of it, this could replicate a lot of the voices towards Israel that we've seen in the past, just criticism and no action. So while it could be more of a build-up that could see more positive changes in the future, I think for now, unless the international community, like the global powers, actually act, it will potentially come to nothing significant.
Now, let's be a little bit specific. We were watching in detail over the 11 days of bombing on the Gaza Strip, and also before that into the proposed evictions from Sheikh Jarrah, the attacks on worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and there are other things happening in Palestinian territories. Well, what can you tell us about those the actual specific things which might be Israeli war crimes? What are we actually talking about here?
I mean, well, what we've seen so far from what Israel has actually done in Gaza and Sheikh Jarrah, I mean, this is just a continuation of what Israel has done since 1948, effectively, when it was founded. And obviously the Gaza Strip has been blockaded by Israel since 2007, and since then it has launched major wars since then, in 2009, 2012, 2014, and most recently. So there are definitely, this is a continuation of what Israel has been doing effectively, and it hasn't received much significant pressure from the international community. Obviously, in the most recent offensive, it bombed a media tower housing Associated Press and ALJAZZAR, but not only that, there were private apartments in that building, so that would have affected many people's livelihoods. And even the fact that the United States is questioning some of Israel's claims regarding its offensive on Gaza does show that it's just highly unlikely that what Israel has said is like legitimate. And in Sheikh Jarrah as well, a lot of the residents have still complained that Israel is imposing a siege on the neighborhoods, which is a historic Palestinian one. And there's still a lot of stopping and searching, and government-backed settlers still do want to ethnically cleanse the neighborhoods. And that is what Israel does want to achieve in the long term regarding the occupied territories. In the West Bank, it still imposes a horrible occupation there, which it wants to either make life so unbearable for the residents so that they would either leave, or just, if it could get away with it, force many people to leave. But since, as I've mentioned, the international community is overwhelmingly silent on this and hasn't taken any steps to condemn it, this status quo will go on. There have been more promising signs, as we've seen from France on Sunday. Even though France is a significant supporter of Israel, France said that while the status quo continues, this could lead to long-lasting apartheid. So these statements do need to be backed up by actions, of course, but in the short term, unless necessary steps are taken to provide a peaceful solution for Palestinians, this will lead to ongoing apartheid.
Of course, with a changing language is also important because it moves the conversation on. Introducing words like apartheid, openly saying things like ethnic cleansing, and also highlighting the responsibilities of occupying powers. I believe even bringing in settlers into occupied territories is a war crime in itself. So these changes in the conversation, could they also be mobilizing people around the world to speak out more openly against the Israeli occupation and in favor of the rights of Palestinians?
It depends on how much it pressures the governments that are overwhelmingly backing this. I mean, France is a good example because France has been a key backer of Israel, but at the same time, it hasn't recognized Palestine, which is an essential solution, which is an essential step for creating a peaceful solution for the Palestinian people. And even the UK, interestingly, it says that it's repeatedly said it condemns Israel's settlement expansion, but it hasn't recognized Palestine. And the United States has also said that we need a two-state solution. Even the Biden administration said that quite recently after Israel's offensive on Gaza, but it hasn't recognized Palestine. So how can you have a two-state solution if you don't recognize Palestine? It just is such a big contradiction in that sense. So I think this is just language to appease the growing criticism within the countries that are supporting Israel. Obviously, we have seen a lot of growing pressure within countries towards the governments, such as the United States. There's a growing condemnation of Israel within the Democrats, and in the UK, France, and many other countries, we've had significant protests against Israel's actions. So I think if this momentum continues, we could see more steps, more words at least, towards condemning Israel's actions, but it's up to the governments to actually act, to take a step forward, recognize Palestine, and ensure that Israel is held accountable for its actions in the occupied territories.
I imagine it's a significant step that the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation managed to get this resolution passed in the UN Human Rights Council, and that in itself is, if an investigation is opened, as the resolution calls for, then more facts will come out. And do you think that will build a momentum, that could potentially build a momentum?
I definitely think that the more pressure is applied, the more impetus it will create for governments to actually act. But like I say, it does depend on the governments to actually act, but it's really quite a difficult situation because many governments, including the US and the UK, are still keen to support Israel.
Yes.
And because we had the International Criminal Court pending investigation into Israel war crimes in Gaza and the the West Bank, but that was criticised by both the United States and the United Kingdom, and that hasn't yet to go through. It's still pending for that reason. Although I think the ICC, the chief prosecutor for the ICC said she is watching carefully. She said that amid Israel's recent offensive on Gaza. So it really is important that governments do follow up on this. Mm-hmm. Obviously, many still have a lot of incentive to push through with support for Israel. There's weapon sales and there's close, historic ties and connections, particularly with the UK and the US. So I think the United States in particular is still keen to continue defending Israel. Even the US ambassador to the UN quite frankly said in February that we will continue defending Israel against criticism within the UN. So with this upcoming potential investigation from the UN, who funds the UN as well?
Yes.
It's mostly the US. The US is a significant funder of the UN, so that could potentially block and pressure the UN into any strong criticism of its actions.
Well, it's very sad that the money is in the weapons of war rather than in the tools of peace. We'll keep watching and see what happens. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. Jonathan Benson-Harvey, thank you. Now, following the ceasefire, the international community started to react against the Israeli war crimes committed, from which Palestinians suffered terrible loss. It started with aid to rebuild Gaza and continues with a resolution by the UN Human Rights Council that includes an international independent investigation commission to probe Israel's human rights violations. All these developments are giving hope to Palestinians for an end to their plight, which has been continuing for years. For now, let's move on to another country which is also experiencing war and destruction for years, namely Syria. Millions of Syrians are displaced due to the ongoing civil war, but how did their suffering start? Let's find out in our infographic. Turkey has described the so-called presidential elections held by the Assad regime as illegitimate, saying that it does not reflect the free will of the Syrian people.
Polling stations have closed in Syria in a so-called presidential election. Syrians in regime-held areas casted their votes in the country's first election since 2014, with a fourth seven-year term for Bashar al-Assad all but guaranteed. An initial 51 candidates have been whittled down to just 3, with Assad standing against 2 obscure rivals.
I am here today, among many other people, to say no to Assad's illegal elections, to say that we do not accept these elections and that they are elections of shame, and that everyone, actually, Syrians and non-Syrians, should be speaking up against these elections.
Thousands took to the streets of the opposition-held city of Idlib in a boisterous rally against the Syrian regime elections. Crowds chanted against Assad and revived slogans used in the early days of the uprising against him. The rally was organized to denounce the elections, which protesters called farcical and illegitimate.
The elections are not legitimate. He is a criminal killer. He killed 2 million Syrians and displaced half of the Syrian population.
Assad first took power in 2000 on the death of his father Hafiz, who had ruled for 30 years before that. Assad's rule has been defined by a decade-long war that erupted after peaceful protests against his authoritarian rule in 2011. The conflict has killed hundreds of thousands of people and driven 11 million from their homes, about half the country's population.
I would say that, to be very honest, once again I lost the hope that my dad might return soon, because as long as Assad is in power, this means that my dad and another 130,000 people will still be detained and forcibly disappear.
And to discuss this, I'm joined live from Sofia, Bulgaria, by Ruslan Trad, who's a security analyst. Ruslan, thank you for joining us today on The Edge. The situation in Syria is still terrible, with conflict continuing. Millions of Syrians displaced both within Syria and also living outside Syria, millions again as refugees. So whilst we all want democracy to be real in Syria, what can we say about this election? Is it a step towards democracy, or is it just for show?
I'm sure that you are also joking with this democracy in Syria, and we know very well from the our conversations related to Russia that this system is not about democracy.
Right.
I mean, how to say, these elections are securing the status quo in Syria. This is not about voters. This is not about returning refugees in Syria. This is not about, at least, some kind of democracy. I mean, if we see the reactions from outside, the first sides congratulated Bashar al-Assad are countries or territories connected to Russia, like Belarus, for example. So these elections are provoked many jokes around Syria, and including in Europe, among Syrians living outside and forced to living outside, to be precise. But out of jokes, these elections are kind of tragedy for all Syrians, including Syrians living in the government-held territories in Syria.
So actually, the reality is, I was being somewhat ironic. The reality is that whilst the statistics look phenomenal, I've lost them just now, something like 80 or 90% turnout was the claim. But of course, the people who were able to vote wasn't actually the normal representation of a country, was it? So how was this election, okay, I'll use the word organized?
Yeah, should be said that the Assad supporters outside Syria, including Syria, but it's very important to be said that supporters of the regime were very active in European Union countries, and they started to prepare for this election season even from the winter. So we saw from the past month, was very consolidated movement of people related to the regime inside European Union, and they presented the election as kind of democracy, as kind of step toward democracy, and they wanted to present the elections in front of Europeans and Western audience as a legitimate vote. So inside Syria, the government of Bashar al-Assad told us that they received 95%.
95.1, please.
Yes, yes, to be precise.
Yes.
So from the 40 million voters, should be said that inside the government-held territories in Syria, the population is almost 9 million, including the children. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine how big is the lie from the regime side. But they don't care, actually, because they know the international community will slam this election, but this is mostly for their own usage.
Yes.
So the game was very clear since beginning.
So what is the way forward? Obviously, the Assad and Assad Senior have been holding a firm grip on Syria for years. There are UN Security Council resolutions in place that one of the criticisms was that the presidential from Turkey was that the presidential elections are incompatible with the criteria, the roadmap for the UNSC Resolution 2254. So what should be the way forward here for a real political solution in Syria?
I should add something from the previous question, because it is connected to this answer. Right. Inside Syria, should be reminded that the government of Bashar al-Assad is controlled only a part of Syrian territory. Mm-hmm. The other part is under rebel and pro-Turkish factions in the north and northeast part of the country. The other part is US-backed Kurdish forces. So actually the elections are, in that meaning, are also illegitimated because they were ignored by the big part of the country. Inside Syria, Bashar al-Assad tried to force people vote for him, including using of militias for this. And in that meaning, I don't see how a political solution is possible for Syria. I mean, till now, thanks to Russia and Iran, Bashar al-Assad survived and actually provided the resources of Syria. And if you see the economic of Syria is only on papers. We see official documents and only numbers, but actually the Syrian economy right now is totally relying on Russia and Iran. And even the poverty is over 80%. You can imagine what is the situation inside Syria. And unemployment is over 50%. So right now, Bashar al-Assad is trying to present that he is the rightful ruler of Syria, and the international community should accept that reality. But we saw that many Syrians, including the recent protests even in the southern part of the country, which is formally controlled by Assad regime, people rise against and start protesting against this rule. So nothing is ended, but Russia and Iran wish to be.
Yes, and indeed it comes full circle with protests continuing as they were 11 years ago, which is what started this current round of conflict. And of course, the economic statistics and unemployment statistics you just quote don't take into account the fact that so many millions, such a huge proportion of the Syrian population isn't even in the country right now. So, so hopefully at some point in the future, not too distant, hopefully peace will return. And that's a huge, well, it will be an even huger humanitarian problem to solve. So this really puts emphasis on the need to make change.
I should remind because of your words are very important. The audience should know that currently the humanitarian aid to Syria is under risk because of the United Nations resolutions are not allowed on the whole territory of Syria, and the humanitarian aid is entering only from asset-controlled areas. And Turkey and other countries in Europe tried to push the regime to accept this humanitarian aid enter to other people also, because another only free corridor is by Turkey. So the problem is huge. There are millions of people inside Syria which have no connection to the humanitarian aid, and they have no even basic services.
It really is a tragedy, and we've seen from Turkey into the north of Syria, and we know that Turkey is hosting about 3.5 million refugees. It really is a dire situation. Ruslan, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge. Thank you. Syria's violent and repressive political system under the Assad regime has ruined the lives of millions of Syrians. They're afraid of the future after over a decade of crimes against humanity, lawlessness, and a regime which has failed to meet the basic needs of their people. Their only hope to end years of violence by Assad against his own people is the international community. Let's now move to our last topic to discuss the relationship between China and the United States. During his election campaign, US President Joe Biden promised to restore the relationship with several countries. But what were his promises? Our infographic has more. After US President Joe Biden ordered a review of intelligence about where coronavirus emerged, China says that politicizing the origins of COVID-19 would hamper further investigation and undermine global efforts to curb the pandemic.
China's foreign ministry hit back at the United States on Thursday after US President Joe Biden ordered a review of intelligence about the origins of COVID-19 this week.
This shows that the US does not care about facts or truth and has zero interest in a serious science-based study of origin. Their aim is to use the pandemic to pursue stigmatization, political manipulation, and blame shifting.
This comes after the Chinese embassy in Washington said in a statement Wednesday that some political forces have been fixated on political manipulation and the blame game. Biden said on Wednesday that US intelligence agencies were divided about whether COVID-19 emerged from human contact with an infected animal or from a laboratory incident. As the WHO prepares to begin a second phase of studies into the origins of the coronavirus, China has been under pressure to give investigators more access amid allegations that it leaked from a Wuhan lab. China has repeatedly denied the lab was responsible.
With 33 million confirmed cases and 600,000 deaths from COVID-19 in the US, both the highest numbers in the world, the US doesn't reflect on its own problems, but rather attempt to make a scapegoat out of China. My question is, what are they up to? Can they sleep at night with an untroubled conscience?
A joint China-WHO study published in March said it was highly unlikely the virus leaked from the lab, adding that it most likely spread from bats to humans via an unidentified intermediary species. China has also continued to point to the possibility that COVID-19 originated in another country and entered via infected frozen food or through Southeast Asian wildlife trade networks.
I'm joined live from Los Angeles in the United States by Chris Haynes, who's an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of New Haven. Chris, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge. Everything seems to be going so well with COVID-19 measures in the United States, and we had the report from the World Health Organization which suggested that it was almost certain that this illness didn't begin in a laboratory. Whilst it is very important for every aspect of the pandemic to be fully understood, what is the purpose of Joe Biden stirring the pot at this time?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would necessarily frame it as stirring the pot, but there has been a slow exodus or slow chorus of leaked information, intelligence reports, and evidence that have suggested that the WHO may have been a little too preliminary in its conclusions about the origin of the coronavirus. To be clear, it generally said that it was very unlikely that the lab leak theory was indeed correct, and put a lot of stock into the other theory, which was that it leaped from animal to humans. With everything that we know now, we know that there's very little evidence to suggest that either are necessarily true. And what the Biden administration is doing is wanting a more thorough, more full, more transparent investigation that allows investigators access to some of the evidence concerning lab workers that had gotten sick and fallen ill with flu or COVID-like symptoms in the late fall of 2019. So far, that information has been denied, and access to that information has been denied by the Chinese government. And I think, that's where the Biden administration is coming from.
So is the reason for this recent announcement which inevitably is putting pressure on China to achieve something that couldn't have been achieved through slightly more diplomatic channels?
No, that's a good point. That said, the Biden administration has been working with its international partners and trying to convince the WHO to undertake a phase 2 part of their investigation. The unfortunate problem is that the Chinese have also played a little bit of politics here, almost seemingly like they're dealing with the Trump administration as opposed to the Biden administration, which has taken a very different tact. You would also think that the Chinese government would be very interested in trying to discount the lab leak theory, not necessarily because it was something that was intentionally done or unintentionally done. I think that's almost besides the point. But you would think that the Chinese government would actually want to provide that information to investigators to clear that theory or to discount that theory as possible.
That's a very good point. Of course, if no one has any guilt to hide, then one should want everything out fully in the open. But perhaps the problem is that the whole, particularly throughout 2020, in the lead up to your presidential elections, Donald Trump and his supporters very overtly and very harshly politicized the pandemic, giving it several different nicknames that I won't bother to repeat here. But
if we're not doing
you know what I mean. But it's a shame that on the one hand that maybe because of that, anything that Joe Biden does now seems to be, and if I was Chinese, I think I would quite rationally say, well, this is just a continuation of what Donald Trump was doing. Are they justified in thinking that?
You know, I think a very novel way of reading the entire situation might say that's justified. That said, if you are an astute watcher of politics in the United States, and I know in China they have a lot of people that do study our politics, they would also know that Joe Biden was very, very different than Donald Trump, especially with the approach to coronavirus. Joe Biden has always said that he is on the side of facts, evidence, and science, and that's the approach that they want to take. And so, unfortunately, I think China has almost played the Trump administration as a foil here, knowing that they're dealing with the Biden administration, and all that's doing is fueling speculation as to why China is not wanting to give neutral or international WHO investigators more access to information to really find out what the origin was so we can prevent this moving forward from happening again.
Which, at the end of the day, is something which would benefit everybody. Now, of course, we can't avoid the fact, I'm sure that many Chinese analysts probably understand American politics better than 99.9% of Americans do. But we can't get away from the fact that there are many... we can't get away from the fact, though, that there are great tensions regional tensions between the US and China, whether it's with trade or whether it's with regards to some military maneuvers in one field or another, whether it's Taiwan or here or there. Do you think this is something which the Biden administration can separate? Because, of course, dealing with understanding the pandemic is something which must be done, but it needs to somehow be separated from all these other complications. Is that something achievable, or is it perhaps part and parcel of the same thing?
Yeah, our former president, Bill Clinton, will call this a compartmentalization. And it's something that President Biden has expressed as his desire to deal with China on issues where both countries can work together successfully, and to oppose China and speak out on China on issues where the two countries disagree. And so this is his intent. This is the intent of the United States government at this point, to try to separate issues like the coronavirus from issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea.
So, and this is a very important point, that he promised to repair ties with China. So this compartmentalization sounds like a very tricky course to maneuver, but Joe Biden has a great deal of foreign affairs experience. That's something that he can navigate, maybe.
Only time will tell. He does have decades of foreign policy experience. He's a very patient individual and very deliberate, much more deliberate than he was in his earlier days, when he would say things that would get him in trouble oftentimes. But I think at this point, every indication is that he is trying to play this balancing act, this high wire act, by trying to speak out against the things that the Chinese government is doing, that the American government and the West, for that reason, is actually very much opposed to, whether it's the Uyghurs in Western China or the Hong Kong situation. And on the other hand, trying to deal with the Chinese government in a way that's constructive and productive, where both governments have vested interests in the same goals. And I would say that the coronavirus, figuring out the origins of the coronavirus and preventions moving forward, is one of those issues where he is trying to engage with the Chinese government.
Well, I guess at the end of the day, as we know all too well, in diplomatic circles, there's a lot of showboating going on. Maybe this is a way of reaching a stage which both of them can be happy at in the future. Chris Haynes, thank you so much for joining us again and giving us your analysis. Thank you. So it seems as if the tense relationship between China and the United States will remain as both countries remain firm, using every topic as political shields to attack each other. Before closing our programme, let's have a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top stories, shared with the hashtag Wuhan Lab Leak. Well, it seems the idea of a Wuhan lab leak had some traction on Twitter. Let's have a look. Deep says another report of US journal, the Wall Street Journal, suggests that the Wuhan lab of China is the main source of COVID. Is it planned? God knows, but still seems like it. And Yoda says, this theory, conspiracy theory, doesn't work for the World Health Organization. But if we remember correctly, that the doctor who invented COVID-19 eventually died in Wuhan because of corona. And Kali Nation says the Wuhan lab cover-up begins. Why did Joe Biden fund this Wuhan lab? Why is he trying to cover up the lab leak issue? Why did Trudeau fund this lab? We need to know. And let's now take a look at our video of the day, which shows the UK Parliament member Zara Sultana, who is accusing the UK government of arms sales to Israel.
Tala, 13, Rula, just 5 years old, her big sister Yara, aged 9. 3 Palestinian children killed in an Israeli airstrike. Shame. The Israeli military murdered 63 other children and 245 Palestinians in its recent assault on Gaza. Shame. The call for Palestinian freedom has never been louder, but this Conservative government is complicit in its denial. Exactly. It has approved more than £400 million in arms to Israel since 2015. So can the Prime Minister look me in the eye and tell me that British-made weapons or components weren't used in the war crimes that killed these 3 children and hundreds of other Palestinians?
Prime Minister, we shouldn't use props, just to remind members.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the whole House understands that nobody wants to see any more of the conflict, of the appalling conflict that we've seen in Israel and Gaza. And everybody wants to, I think we're all glad that there's now a ceasefire and a de-escalation. And as for the position of the British government, I think that it's probably common ground across most members of this House that what we want to see is a two-state solution. Mr. Speaker, that is what the UK government has campaigned for many, many years, and that continues to be our position.
All for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boynes. Stay tuned as I'll be back with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.